Targeted Grazing Workshop for 2015. This series is called Targeted Grazing for Vegetation Management and Landscape Enhancement. It's brought to you by the Targeted Grazing Committee of the Society for Range Management. It's a 5-module series, and today is the last presentation on monitoring approaches. We'd like to thank our sponsors who have made this series of webinars available. It is brought to us by Dr. Marc Horney. Marc is a member of the Targeted Grazing Committee of the Society for Range Management, but he's also a faculty member of Animal Sciences at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. Marc has a broad background in ruminant nutrition and rangeland ecology. He also specialized not only in just domestic animals, but also studies wild grazing animals. He's been working for a good long time on monitoring strategies for rangeland management, and he works both on the ground, and he'll talk a lot about those strategies today, but also he's examined and worked in remote sensing strategies from the air. He has a background in cooperative extension both in Colorado and in California, and in areas of livestock and natural resource management. And finally, before he came to the university, he worked as a range management specialist with NRCS in California.
And let's go. Okay, well, I'm glad everyone was able to join today, and I'm looking forward to this presentation, although this is always kind of intimidating doing these talks. Again, as Rachel said, my name is Marc Horney. I work as a faculty member at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, California, and today we're going to be talking about monitoring approaches for targeted grazing. I'm really interested in all aspects of targeted grazing, but one of the things that when I work with ranchers, and I work a lot with the BLM and Forest Service, I realize that one thing that's really important is it's key to being successful with these kind of projects is monitoring what's happening and getting information about how things are working, and looking for opportunities to make refinements and adjustments, and also document what you've been doing. So with that, I think I'm just going to roll ahead and roll forward with this presentation. Okay, so let me first lay out the thing that's probably obvious to more than a few of you, is just simply what monitoring is. And the purpose of monitoring is just to collect information about the plants, the animals, the environmental system that you're manipulating with targeted grazing practice, and kind of study what's going on. So the characteristics you should be interested in are the ones that are related to the objectives of the targeted grazing. And so those objectives can be anything, as has been reviewed in the previous presentations, things like, removing or suppressing an invasive weed, or improving, the habitat structure for a wildlife species, or any of a long list of other things. But what you're trying to monitor needs to be closely related to exactly the specific objectives for the project. So the monitoring work can produce evidence and information about the progress or lack of progress on the project towards those objectives. Commonly what's done is to repeat monitoring at periods over time, and that information can then be used to gauge the magnitude or the size of the change that you're producing, the direction of the change that's occurring, and then hopefully the speed, the rate at which the change is occurring. Okay, and these are the things that are all happening to those particular characteristics related to your objectives. So why monitor? Well, there are a lot of possible reasons why you should. I'll touch quickly on just 4 things. One, if you're providing contract services, monitoring may very well be required as part of the contract for doing that work. So that's one reason, to provide documentation of what was done and how successful it was. 2, if you're trying to market a business enterprise, like many people in California, we're kind of getting quite a few folks getting into the business of vegetation management using livestock. Being able to collect information and data about the successes of your projects certainly can be one way of developing credibility and being able to become used as a kind of useful marketing tool. Then the areas that I get more personally involved in are using the monitoring reveal facts that are useful for informing management actions. So as as a targeted grazing project goes, and most of them are going to last for multiple years, and collecting information as you go along, either annually or every couple of years as you proceed, is helpful for determining how well you're staying and you're making approaches to those objectives that you had set out. And I can tell in the background somebody's not got phone muted. All right, so moving along, monitoring is important then finally to demonstrate how effective you've really been. Bless you. Okay, I'm going to use throughout this presentation an example of some projects we're doing with our students here on campus. So a couple of years ago, one of our students offered that she thought it'd be a great idea to bring some goats onto campus and use them for doing vegetation management around the campus facilities. So we've got that underway. And so I'm going to refer to this map and some of the projects that are going on and talking about the different ways that we are either currently monitoring or preparing to start monitoring some of these projects and kind of give hopefully a kind of a practical explanation of how they're used. So moving on to the next step before getting into discussing the different kinds of monitoring, let me just make a few statements about some of the fundamentals of monitoring. First off, it's really important to choose and fit monitoring methods and the timing to those objectives of the project. And I'll elaborate on that a little bit here shortly. Two, it's also important to monitor only the things that are really important for the success of the project and do those things well. In my work with people both working for NRCS and Cooperative Extension, the thing that I saw bury many projects that were trying to do monitoring was people trying to be a little bit ambitious. And so my recommendation is usually to stay focused on the things that you are able to do and are realistic within the limitations of the time, the expertise, and the skill set that you have. And so you may not be everything that you want the monitor to be at the very beginning, but if you get good at it and you do well with some basic monitoring skills, you have the opportunity for adding to that later on. So I usually recommend that people just start small and simple with monitoring practices and expand it as you have the ability to. And then finally, adjust monitoring. That's entirely possible to make some changes to the practices that you started off with. It is really useful to be able to stay as consistent over time as you can, but every once in a while you will discover that there's a much, much better way to do things, and on balance, it's probably going to be to your advantage to just make a change and shift over to a different method or a different system of approach. So now getting in a bit more into the weeds. So I want to say a few words about baseline assessments and then comparing that to what I consider to be monitoring work. What a baseline assessment is it's a collection of information that helps a project manager to produce some explicit project objectives. For instance, this one I've thrown up on the screen. One project objective could be to reduce spotted knapweed infestation to less than 500 plants per acre in 6 years' time. Okay, that's great. You might ask, okay, so where do those numbers come from? That's a good question. The numbers are going to be most meaningful if you've done already, ahead of the project, a baseline assessment, and you've gone to see how much spotted knapweed is infesting this area. And let's say the baseline assessment showed that there were 1,200 plants per acre. So you decide, all right, so we're going to try to aim for reducing this to, let's say, less than 500 plants per acre, and that's going to be our objective for the project, at least in the short term. And so the baseline assessment produces some information about that particular location and time that you can use to set up some short-term and some longer-term goals for what the project should be. And so this, as you monitor the results year after year, helps you to see whether you're actually gaining ground on that particular objective. The baseline data, so you can use it to establish short-term objectives like I just described. And then you can use it as a benchmark to test certain specific grazing impacts against. Okay, so as the years go on, your post-grazing surveys, or depending on how you structure it, the pre-grazing in the next year should be finding significantly less than, say, 38% leafy spurge, and you should be gaining ground each time. So that's the function of baseline assessments, at least in this way. All right, so the monitoring practices that I'm going to describe fall into the category of what some people have described as being effectiveness monitoring. So the function of effectiveness monitoring is to check the results of the grazing practice against the objectives for the project. So back to our spotted knapweed infestation, this is where you would remeasure the spotted knapweed infestation every year or every other year and compare that to the initial baseline. So a couple things that I wanted to say about key points for setting up and carrying out a monitoring practice. And number one is going to be that as you're defining the project for targeted grazing, make sure that your management objectives are specific and stated as things that really actually can be measured. So you should also keep in mind that the more precise and detailed the measurements are, or the measures that you want to make, the more difficult and time-consuming and certainly expensive they're going to prove to be to gather. So, I live now in a world of academics here at the university, and I'm always thinking of little details that'd be really cool to know. And a lot of times those little details, and actually they become lots of details after a period of time, really begin to sink and drag down the monitoring effort. So, if you are doing a project on your own or you're providing a service, you really need to keep it as streamlined as possible and focus specifically on the tasks that are important. Okay, that was my curious people statement there. Before the management action begins, you should try to collect baseline data. Even if you've got some other information you can use, the baseline information is very often extremely helpful. Another thing that the collecting baseline data will do is the particular method that you use for collecting this data should be the same thing that you use in doing the monitoring for years afterwards. And there's been a number of occasions where I've thought I had a great idea for making a measurement of the vegetation on a site that I was trying to manipulate. And when I got to the field to do the baseline assessment, I realized in doing that work that the method that I thought was so great turned out to have some major deficiencies and some problems that I really hadn't thought through beforehand. And it's much better to sort that out before you get yourself committed to doing something and sort that out ahead of time. Now my last slide on the key points. So monitoring responsibilities should be thought about and kind of worked out at the very beginning of the project. So the things that are important are what's going to be monitored. That goes back to the project objectives, as I've talked about before. How you're going to do it. And so in the slides to come, we're going to talk about monitoring methods and practices. And then when it's going to be monitored and who's going to be responsible for doing it. In some cases, if you're doing contract work, some of these things may need to be spelled out in a contract. If you're doing this on your own, at least you need to kind of put together a plan for how this is going to come together, and if there's going to be other people besides yourselves who's responsible for doing some of this, those responsibilities need to be spelled out and agreed upon before you get into it. Contextual information, like weather events and wildlife and insect impacts, those things are all important for interpreting the results that you will get from monitoring. So it's not simply enough to go out and make the measurements that I'm going to talk about shortly. It's also useful to put those measurements in a particular context. So doing things like collecting photographs of the site as you're making the measurements, and keeping records of the numbers of animals that were present and when the grazing occurred and what kind of weather events had happened, all makes understanding those results a lot better. And then I did mention a couple slides back that it is possible that if you decide you're using a method that's really not practical, certainly you can change. But to the extent that you can, it's really helpful to keep things as consistent as you're able to, because that does help with the interpretation of changes in the landscape that occur as a result of the grazing influence. So the more consistent you can keep it, the better. So you may change it once, maybe twice over a period of years, but as much as you can, try to keep things simple and consistent. And if you do make changes, be sure that you document them. Okay, so let's get back to this goat enterprise. So let me give you a couple of examples of things that we're working on here on the campus and talk about the monitoring that we're trying to do as part of this. So I've pulled up now an image of one of the new dormitories that the campus built called Sarah Vista. So the objective at this site is the fire marshal. So our campus abuts some annual grassland and some steep hills right above the dormitories, and the fire marshal had required that the campus maintain or manage the fuel loading right up to the edge of the dormitories. So our fine fuels reduction is our primary objective. We decided that we were going to try to manage this grassland to keep the fuels limited to about 500 pounds per acre during the period when we're at risk of fire. So that's generally from June in California through October, November of that year. Our main target in this case was going to be the annual grass residues. Around the doors, we got a collection of a few mustard species and a number of annual grasses. Those plants dry out usually by the end of May, certainly by the middle of June. And the time period for doing the work was going to be June through July. In other words, we were going to use the goats in our project to knock all that down and remove that biomass, beginning in the middle of June and ending up being completed by the end of July. And those of you who are familiar with California may go, yeah, but why would you turn goats out onto essentially just dry grass at that time when you could go in there and graze that a couple of months earlier, much more profitably for the goats? And our problem is being in the university campus, we're managing the goats with electronet fencing, and the goats are an enormous temptation for the student residents in the dorms, so we just decided it was going to be a lot simpler and saner to wait until the students had left for the summer to bring the goats in to get this work done. The monitoring that we chose to do here was going to be a combination of both photo point monitoring and biomass residues. And so these are a couple of the photo points. So on my map in the cyan colors, you can see the locations where we've established some photo points. And these are some of the pictures that we've taken before the grazing began a year ago at this particular location. And so these just kind of give us an ability to sit down with either the fire marshal or the campus facilities management staff and describe for them what the project was, what things looked like before the animals came in, and how we left it when it was completed. Okay. All right, and so I'm going to cue up a video here where I'm going to have having a conversation with Beth Reynolds, and Beth is the manager of our small ruminant program, and she's going to talk about what she and the students found as a result of doing this project this last year.
Okay, yeah, so this site was pretty much the same makeup as the pen we just looked at, with a lot of mustard in the last 3 or 4 feet, a belt of grass, and then kind of a steep slope. So, looking at the amount of material that was here, they removed a lot and they broke a lot down. The stuff that remains is, like I said, some of these thicker trunks, but a lot of the grass they either ate or broke down, so I would say that's really good. But with this terrain, it's really, really steep on the left-hand side here, and they definitely worked it over a little more than I would have liked. The bottom half, I think, looks pretty good. Again, from a fire point of view, I mean, a fire could sort of smolder across, but it's going to be very, very low lying and, really slow moving. So I think they got rid of the height of the plants and got it down to the surface of the soil, which is really important. And, everything else they managed to eat. So.
About using that particular site and some of the results. So we are in now the second year of doing this particular project, so we're still adjusting and refining some of the methods that we used. We had another location on the side of another dorm called Poly Canyon Village on the north side. Again, this was primarily fine fuels reduction, but also we had to protect some ornamental plantings that the facilities had put on the north side of a parking structure. Our target here was, again, reducing annual grass residues, and the time period was the same as the other dorm. On this particular place, we're also continuing our photo monitoring work. We're also doing biomass for quantifying the amount of the annual grass residues that we're removing, and also we were using a belt transect, and I'll talk about a belt transect just in a few minutes, and that's a technique for counting things. And so on this site, the things that we were counting were the the native shrub plantings that the facilities management had put on this particular hillside. So we're trying to come up with a way that we could, quantify, how many of those shrubs were still alive after the goat treatment had been completed, and at least be able to reassure facilities. Coming towards the end here, we've got there we go. So another part of this dormitory, we had a brush encroachment. Actually, it wasn't so much a brush encroachment as the facility staff who planned this particular area out decided that they wanted to plant a native shrub called a coyote brush. The downside was they planted it really densely, and so they asked it to come back and use the goats to try and suppress the brush, because now that those plants have gotten established, it's becoming really dense, and the fire marshal wasn't too excited about the result. So on this particular site, we're coming in, this is in a riparian area, and our main concern was that in this riparian zone, it's actually possible that if a wildfire were to come into the dormitory area, it could travel through the riparian zone and get access to the interior of the residence area. And so one of the things that we're trying to do here is keep the fine fuels reduced. We're trying to control louder fuels in the riparian area, and we also want to try and demonstrate that we're able to keep the coyote brush suppressed. We're not trying to remove it, we're just trying to keep the density of the brush cover sufficiently low that we're not going to be so concerned about the fire carrying through it rapidly. And I think I'm going to skip through this.
For here and what when you're managing this with the goats, what do you want to see? What do you want this site to look like?
I'll do a quick clip on this.
Okay. So this site has really been challenging over the years because they hydro-seeded this, so it's very dense, more than it would ever be naturally. So they're very slender bushes and they're very close together. So it's pretty thick for being 6 years old since they hydro-seeded it. The other thing is, as we mentioned earlier, is the timing of this. This plant they completely consume in the spring when it's really, really green and lush. The leaves are big. They eat it. They knock it down. They break the branches with their horns, and they'll really take it down really low to the ground. This time of the year, sometimes it's flowering, sometimes it's just really kind of yellowy, so they just don't seem to go for it as much. They'll go for the dark green parts of the plant, but a lot of the yellower stuff or anything that's flowering, they literally won't touch. So, but they want us to do it in the fire season, so here we are clearing it, in probably late August, early September, and what I hope to achieve is putting this into very small sections, maybe 4 rolls of electric netting, so 150 feet on each side, and letting them clear it in about 2 days and just keep moving them.
Okay.
So with brush this thick or even thicker, having them dense, stocking density is really, really important. So I want them as close together as they can, just to maximize each section. But the other thing about this site is the brush to grass ratio. So the goats definitely like brush, but they also like grass. And so for the first few days they get a mixture of grass and brush and they seem content. But as the pen goes on, there's no more grass. They're scraping the ground for every little bit that they can get left, and there's still a lot of brush left that they would eat. So this site tends to be hard to balance how much grass they should be eating versus how much brush they could be eating. So if I could graze them separately, that would be ideal. So that is the most limiting factor, is leaving some grass residue without denuding it too much, but also getting the bushes making an impact, at least enough that they've eaten them and knocked them down, racked their horns on it a bit, and created some trails through here. And they have.
Okay, so I'll skip on from that one. I'm going to come back and talk about that site when we get into discussing the line point intercept and the other methods, simply because, as Beth was describing, the goats really began to push the grass much harder than they do the brush on that site, and I've got a concern, being that that's a bit of a slope on that hill. I am concerned about creating bare ground underneath that brush and creating a potential erosion hazard. So we're trying to figure out a way to refine the grazing, either by shifting the time of year or some other management, so that we can still leave some litter and material on the ground. Last site is an irrigated beef pasture that's nearby the dorms. This has a different kind of problem. In this site, we've got a purple star thistle infestation here, and the time period for this that we're doing the management is February to April. I wanted to mention this because on this site, what we've got is a plant that's distributed across the pasture. What we're trying to do is use some grazing and some other treatment techniques to reduce and remove the purple star thistle out of that irrigated pasture site. And I put on here at the bottom, the monitoring method here I'm trying to use a nested rooted frequency, or what's called a frequency frame. And this is a tool that's used for counting or establishing the population of a plant in an area. And so we're going to be using these techniques to work on this, and the goal is going to be to try to show the change in the plant population of the purple star thistle over time. And so with this, I'm going to move on now to talking about some of these specific monitoring methods and explaining how they can be used and what they're useful for. Okay, so applying monitoring methods, you're ordinarily trying to find some particular characteristic that you can measure somehow. One of the things that you can measure is the composition of an area. In other words, what kind of different sorts of plants are found there. And as with that last project with the purple star thistle, the goal is to shift the composition so that purple star thistle becomes a more minor part of that entire pasture. And so composition, in this case, you might be referring to either the type of plant, whether it's shrubs or forbs or grasses, or you can use the type to categorize things any way that you find useful. So here, in California, oftentimes I have my students simply segregating things according to whether they're an annual grass or a perennial grass, legumes in some locations, or whether they're an invasive plant or a native. So you can divide this however you like. A lot of times in the science work that we do, we're trying to identify particular species. So with composition, you can approach it a couple different ways. One of which is to look at the frequency of the plant's occurrence. So for this, we could use a Quadrat frame, or an elaboration of that, which I'll describe in a couple more slides, is what's called a nested rooted frequency frame. So it's a square frame you place on the ground, and you can use this to record how often a particular plant appears in that landscape. Another thing you may look at is going to be the density of the plant. That's the count of the plant per unit area. And there are two commonly used ways for doing this. One's a simple quadrat, but what I mean by a quadrat is just an open square frame of a known size you can put on the ground. A common quadrat size is, say, 1 square foot, or maybe a half a meter. But anyway, you know what the dimensions of this thing are. You lay it on the ground, and you can count the number of plants of the different species or different types that are within it, and that gives you a density. Square foot frame are often popular because what you have the ability to do in that case is to take 25 plants per square foot and change that up to the number of plants per acre. The last thing is the canopy cover. So another way to look at the composition of the vegetation in an area is how much of that plant's canopy is actually the uppermost or top layer canopy in a site. And so how much of the soil in an area is being covered up by canopy of a particular type of plant or a particular plant species. This can be done by, again, the Quadrat, or you can use another technique like the line point intercept, which is chiefly used for looking at exposed soil, but it can also collect data related to the cover of the ground by plants. Another vegetation attribute is biomass. That one's pretty simple and straightforward. So in this case, we're going to use a Quadrat frame, and we're going to clip the amount of vegetation that's in it. And you can use this for a variety of things. So, one, if you're in the middle of a grazing period and you want to monitor how much forage is left for the animals, then you can do these biomass clippings to monitor that change over time. If, in the case, say, of our fuels management projects on campus, we want to be able to, produce reports for the fire marshal and for the campus facilities managers about how much biomass is being left behind by the grazing treatments each year going into the fire season. And then the last one I'm going to talk about here is going to be structural characteristics. And what I mean by the structural characteristics of the vegetation on a site can be things like the visual obstruction, and this is commonly applied to brush or shrubby areas. So when you, like, for instance, the coyote brush that we have on the site, the coyote brush, we're trying to measure the impact that we're having on the coyote brush by using a what's called a cover pole method to determine how dense the brush is. And so we're trying to demonstrate before the goats come in, we have a cover density of some particular level, and so let's say it's over 50% canopy density in the site, and after the goats come out, we may have brought it down to, say, 25% canopy density. And so that's how this particular method is going to be used. So let me move on to the sampling methods. There are two common ways that samples are collected. One of them is by using what's called a transect, which is a measured line or a distance, and the samples are taken over the course of that frame. So the Transect line, you take like a Quadrat frame and take it down the line and take repeated measurements down along the line. The function of this is that on a landscape you may find a lot of variation in the different types of vegetation on that landscape, and so what you will do with the Transect is use that to sample different areas of vegetation types on that landscape, and the Transect line collects a group of measurements together. So the Transect line is supposed to represent one single kind of plant community, and the series of frames that you read and the measurements you make along that line allow you to not only come up with an average characteristic for that plant community, but it also allows you to tease out the variability of that characteristic. So let's keep something simple like biomass. So I can say clip 10 frames along a Transect line, and on my biomass, let's say it comes up to an average of 2,400 pounds of dry vegetation per acre on the line, that Transect line. But if I've taken, say, 10 samples, then I may know that while the average is 2,400, it ranged along that Transect line from 800 to 3,500 pounds per acre, and so that gives you a sense of not only what the average is, but also how much it varies over time, and that's useful for quite a few of these different measurements. Another way to approach it is to just do random plots, and that's also pretty commonly done, or I'll say you can either do them randomly, as we'll do in a scientific experiment, or you can select representative plots. So you go out in an area, you may be familiar with the site and know that you've got some slopes out there that are very low producing areas, and you've got some bottomland that has very high production, and you may decide you're going to collect a series of kind of samples within each of those two different sites, and you can do that using a Transect, or you could simply just drop a few kind of pseudo random points in that area and collect some samples that way. But these are the two common ways that the data that I'm going to describe will be collected. All right, whoops, and I forgot to bring my representative slot in. Okay, so whether a thing is representative or not, being able to look at a site and seeing what you are measuring with the tool is going to be important, because you're going to need to think about whether the samples that you have taken really represent what is there and what's being affected by the grazing treatment. So on this particular site, I've got my Quadrat frame dropped on a perennial bunch grass, and it's surrounded by looks like some low sage at this site. And so the question is, okay, so how many of these Quadrat frames might I need to kind of drop or seed around the area to hit the perennial bunch grasses and the open ground and the low sage often enough to fairly represent their real distribution on that landscape. On a research trial, I'd probably be looking at some hundreds of samples in order to be able to represent that. If you're going to do it, if you don't have that time and that budget to be able to do it, then you may just have to stop and collect some samples that seem to represent what, by your eye, is the natural variation and the natural distribution of those plants at that site. I just kind of wanted to point this out. This looks a whole lot better in terms of sampling, that the area immediately around my frame looks a lot more similar to what's inside of the frame. Yeah, and so on. Okay, so let's talk about monitoring methods. So the first one I want to describe is probably the simplest one. This is called the photo point method. The photo point monitoring is simply where you, on a landscape, establish some fixed locations where over time you will come back and repeat photographs of a particular object on that landscape, and it allows you to see the physical changes of the place. The requirements to do this properly are: one, you fix locations. So in photo point monitoring, you want to return back to the same location, same site, and take the photograph of the same basic objects. And what you want to see is what is happening around those objects. Usually you want to have a kind of a landmark object that's in the photograph that you can orient yourself to. This is a qualitative method, and normally it's going to be an intentional selection of some representative site. The fundamental thing that's critical about photo point monitoring is it's best done when you are choosing a place that you expect to change in response to the management. So this is a slide showing someone doing this photo point monitoring. Mind you, this is a few years old, but it gets the point across. So in the foreground of the photograph, we've got a marker set that identifies the site and the date the photograph was taken. The person has a couple of photographs that were taken previously of this location, and they're trying to reproduce this with the camera image. And the goal is that over time, let's say, so this was a riparian treatment area, the goal was to encourage the recruitment of willows on this site, and the expectation was that over time, so years in this case, the photographs should eventually show filling in by the willows and a successful recruitment. And so this is what you would use photo point for monitoring for in a number of other places. Let's see. I've got another example here. On this site that was used for the monitoring, obviously at the very beginning of the project, okay, there's no willows on this particular location. We've got an abundance of yellow star thistle on the site. We've got evidence of bank erosion, and we've got trailing going on. The goal here is to alter the management, do some plantings, do some control of the yellow star thistle, and try to rehabilitate this location. And so a series of photographs taken at this place over time will help to document exactly what's occurred and whether we've been successful at it or not. The next monitoring method is the frequency frame. Now, what the frequency frame is used for is to determine how often a plant species or a vegetation type occurs on a landscape. More specifically, it's used to immediately determine what the percentage. So on a landscape, let's say we have say 30% rose clover, or 15% purple star thistle, or 45% purple needlegrass. So it's used to kind of sort out how common different species of plants are, or different types of plants are on a landscape. It also can be used to establish the percent cover, either by species or type, or simply a total cover to show how much of the ground is being covered by vegetation. And it's used to track changes in these populations over time. The method that I'm going to illustrate here is what's called the nested rooted frequency frame. And this is a quantitative method, and most commonly this is done using a transect, although that's not necessary. So this is what the nested rooted frequency frame looks like. The way this is done, so the frames are set up so that you've got generally 4 different squares inside of the frame, and that's the nested part. Usually the way that it works is you start from the smallest frame and read up so we're going to start from the photograph you can see of the student reading the frame, and the upper right hand corner is what we're going to consider to be the smallest area on the frame. And the student's going to move up the frame, and she's going to record on a sheet which plant was in the smallest frame on the cell, and then she's going to move up to the next largest frame and the next largest frame and then the final frame. And in each case, she's going to record every new plant that she sees. So every plant that's observed in this is only recorded one single time. And so as you move out from the first frame, which I call A, she'll record all the plants that occur in frame A. Then she'll move on to the next largest frame, which is B, and she'll record any new plants that she sees in B, and then on to C, and then on to D. And then you'll repeat this over the transect line and come up with a counting of all the different plants that occurred and in how many frames they occurred on the transect line. And so in this case, my example here, if you had dandelions occurring in 2 out of 5 frames that were red, the frequency of the dandelions is going to be 40%. Okay, this is a continuation of the same thing. The next method is called the line point intercept. The purpose of the line point intercept is to determine how well the soil surface is covered up and protected by plants and litter. It can be used also to identify some of the more common plants at a site. So this is another quantitative method, and normally this is done along a transect. So this is what the line point intercept looks like. So what's typically done is you'll use a pin flag or another kind of narrow metal stake. You'll walk along the line, and at specific intervals, commonly 2 feet intervals, you'll drop the pin down to the ground right along the marker on the transect line, and you'll record what the pin intercepted. So you record the top plant that was struck and any other new species of plants that touched the pin flag going down to the ground, and then record whether there's litter present and what kind of soil you've gone into, whether you've actually gone into bare soil or whether you've gone into hit or struck a rock or a cryptogamic crust or something else. And so you will record here a series of hits along that transect line. What you'll be looking for is how many places you set the pin directly into bare ground with nothing covering it. And that's the main function of the line point intercept method. It can serve to record, you can record using that pin flag the different species of plants that you hit going down the transect line, and because of that you can use it for recording what plant species are there. But I find that it's not a very efficient tool for collecting information about the plant species that are present, that one of the Quadrat frame, like the nested rooted frequency frame, is often a much more efficient way of capturing plants, because as you can imagine, walking along a narrow tape and dropping a pin every couple of feet, you're going to be missing quite a few plants that may be out there. The next method is the belt transect method. Now this is used to simply count things on the landscape, and using the belt you can produce a count of things within a defined area. So for instance, here's how the method works. You'd walk along one of these transect lines some set distance, and you're going to carry with you a pole of some specific length. So 6 to 9 feet is pretty common, held horizontally. So you can imagine walking along a transect line kind of like a tightrope walker with the pole extending across it. And what you do in this case is you count the number of objects that fall within the distance of that pole going down the length of the tape. This is another quantitative method. It's used as a transect system, and here's a couple of examples of people doing a belt transect. Now, a couple quick statements about using the belt. It's best used for plants and other objects in the landscape that are relatively uncommon, because you can so it doesn't take a whole lot of plants to begin running up ridiculously large numbers. And so this is commonly used is for detecting things that are somewhat common but not terribly so, and you're trying to use the belt transect repeated over time to simply see whether the numbers of those things are increasing or decreasing. You can accomplish much the same way with a nested rooted frequency frame. That can also do it, but it really kind of depends on what kind of objects you're working with. I have used a belt transect for, say, monitoring the number of baby sagebrush plants that I'm working with in some sage grouse habitat areas that I'm in. So I'm looking for either new sagebrush plants coming in or old sagebrush or or sagebrush plants that have recently died. Those are less common things, and I can at least keep an inventory of approximately how many of those there are per acre. And the way that this works is, say I'll walk a 100-foot distance with the pole, and if I'm using a 6-foot wide pole, then the number of things, if I counted, say, 60 baby sagebrush plants in a 600 square foot area, it's pretty easy to convert that over to numbers of those plants per acre. And so it can be used in this way. Okay, coming towards the end here, another technique, and this relates back to the brush management, is this tool called the cover pole. And so what you're seeing here on the image on the right hand side is a PVC pipe that's about 2 meters tall. The PVC pipe has been marked so that you can see the distance, and then this one is about 220 centimeters, 200 centimeters. And what you do with the pole is you set the pole at intervals along the transect line, and you sight the pole through a short rod. So I'll have a 1 meter stick that I'll carry with me that has a 1/4 inch hole drilled through it. And at distances of about 15 feet away from the pole, I'll work my way down the transect line, and I'll look through the sight on the small rod to see how much of the pole is visible. That is, it's not obstructed by the brush. And so in this case, you can use this to determine what kind of impact that grazing animals have had on a dense shrubby area. So we would record the pole and see what fraction of the pole was concealed by the brush before grazing began, and then come back in, rerun the transect lines, and make the pole measurements again after the grazing has ceased to see if the area has opened up more and more of the pole is exposed. So it's just a technique for being able to see these changes. This has primarily been used for a wildlife habitat, and there are a number of wildlife species that require a certain amount of cover, or at least the management practices is specifying that a certain amount of cover at particular heights be maintained, and this is a tool that can be used to do that. I've got a link down here on the bottom at the Landscape Toolbox site that goes into much more detail about how to do this. The Quadrat frame, I won't stay long here, so the purpose of it is to simply allow you to collect some information about something happening at a specific location. And so here I use these for sampling biomass, for estimating the amount of ground that's covered by litter or live plants. You can also use this for frequency estimation for some plant species. And the method is simply to use a frame as a reference for clipping material and estimating the percent canopy cover, because the frame gives you an easy visual reference for going, okay, well, let's see, I can imagine the amount of exposed soil here looks like about 25%. This is a quantitative method, and it's a tool that's used to support some of these other measurement methods, and you can use this either on its own or in association with the transect line. Okay. Okay, and lastly, I'm going to close this with a word about what I'm calling photometric approaches, and that is the use of digital cameras to collect some similar kinds of information. As you can imagine, a lot of these methods, they really do take some substantial time out in the field, and it takes quite a while to become sufficiently skilled. You can speed the processes up, but even so, they all will take some time. So another approach, Terry Booth and some others working with USDA ARS and the Bureau of Land Management developed a software product called SamplePoint. And this software product allows you to use a digital camera to take pictures of vegetation on landscapes and do some of this work that I've been showing you back at your home office or in the lab after the fact. So one of the things that I like about using a digital camera to record what's present on the site and go back later on and make my measurements on the images is that, one, it provides a permanent record of what the place looked like and what the specific samples that I was collecting looked like back in the time. And it also, it allows you the flexibility. So sometimes you don't have a lot of people available to you to help to get the work done. And so I found that this sampling pole that you see here, I can run this all by myself, and so I can go shoot transects in 5 or 6 minutes with the camera, and I can do I can go from doing 2 or 3 or 4 transects in a day by myself to doing 10 or 12 or 15 pretty easily with traveling in between. I'll show this video real quick of some students using this particular method. And so this is simply using the frame, walking the frame along the transect line, and shooting the photos. Now, the way that this frame that I'm using was set up was that you can actually see the transect tape at the lower edge of the image. You can actually read and see where you are along the line when you look at the images. And sometimes that's going to be really useful. And my crew is just walking along and setting it up and quickly taking the shots. This particular camera has the advantage of having a wireless remote, but for most other cameras that you have, if they don't have a wireless ability, you can get a wired remote for them as well, which works just as well. Okay. And then the result of that is this is a screenshot of SamplePoint. So with SamplePoint, what the software does is for the image, the software generates a series of crosshairs that are laid out across the image. And as you go along, what the software does is ask the user to identify what the crosshair is on, and you click. You go down to the bottom of the screen. You can click a button that corresponds to the particular kind of plant or kind of surface feature that it is, and it jumps you automatically from point to point to point across the image. It's not perfect for everything, but it is fairly useful for doing some of this work when your pool of labor and help is limited. Okay. With that, I think I'm going to bring this to a wrap. I know that I probably overshot my time by more than a few minutes. So the measurement methods that I've covered included PhotoPoint, which is our one qualitative method, the nested rooted frequency frame, the line point intercept, the belt transect, the simple quadrat, and the SamplePoint method.
Well, thank you, Dr. Marc Horney, for that great presentation on using monitoring methods in targeted grazing projects. Here are a few of the references that Marc had in his presentation and that he recommends for learning more about monitoring methods. If you want to learn more about targeted grazing, get on your computer and head on over to targetedgrazing.wordpress.com. That is the website for the Targeted Grazing Committee of the Society for Range Management. And on that site, you'll find the other 4 presentations in this online workshop series. You'll also see other presentations that we've conducted as a team and other resources such as the Targeted Grazing Handbook and journal articles on targeted grazing. So thanks a lot for listening in, and good luck on all your future targeted grazing projects.